There are 16 Colossal Swords in total, and we are going to rank all of them from worst to best based on how useful and how well they perform in PvE. Now, these are just the Colossal Swords that you see on screen right now. It does not include Colossal weapons. Those are a separate category. So if you actually did want to see those types of weapons, we'll cover those at a later date. But for today, we're just going to go cover these 16 right here. Starting off at the bottom, the Troll's Knight Sword, which is a split magic-based Colossal Sword that does get a very poor intelligence scaling, only a D in that stat, so it's definitely not going to be much of a strength and intelligence-based option. It doesn't really get much range, total overall damage is not that high, it doesn't get a unique skill, and it cannot be infused. Its skill is Troll's Roar, which is actually a pretty decent skill and somewhat underrated, as it does do some nice stance damage in an AoE. The follow-up attack is pretty slow, but it can be useful in some situations. But this skill is not unique at all, and you can put this skill onto other Colossal Swords, and is this going to do more damage? Because yeah, this weapon cannot be infused. It just gets stuck with this skill, stuck with poor scalings. I don't know why this weapon just didn't come with like the Great Blade Phalanx version of the Ash of War, like what the Troll's Knights actually use. And instead of just like adding it onto the weapon, they decided to make a whole brand new weapon in the MOONRITHYLL'S Knight Sword that has the exact same model and just gives it the skill that this one deserved. So yeah, this thing is just completely useless. The only positive thing that I can say about it is that it does get the ZWEIHANDER poking heavy attack, but in that instance, you could just use a ZWEIHANDER. Number 15, the Greatsword of RADAHN Light. Okay, yeah, this weapon is going to be as low as it is because there is another Greatsword of RADAHN in the Lord version that has the exact same weight, range, scalings, damage, but it just gets a better skill. So this one is just going to be pretty much useless in this game because the skill of the Light version does a pretty long animation, shit damaging attack, terrible stance damage. It's just like not worth it at all. There are very few circumstances in this game to where this skill can actually be useful, but as I've mentioned before, there is nothing I hate more in this game than these dog shit ass weapons right here. This thing is so unbelievably disappointing that it just disgusts me. Like, it's disgusting. Like, let me tell you what this weapon should have been like. To where the skill is actually a stance that lets you pick one or the other. It should have had a unique light attack combo. It should have had like a blood flame heavy attack. It should have had a faith scaling with some split holy damage. We can actually make it have good scalings. Just let it have a B scaling in strength, dexterity, intelligence, and faith. Why not? You're going to be doing 3 different damage types. It's not like it's going to be like the hardest hitting thing in the game. It's just going to get really high amounts of AR, and you get it off the most bullshit boss. I think it's a pretty fair trade. But instead we've got this very generic, just lazy reskinned version of a weapon that just gets the basic generic ass Colossal Sword moveset and the exact same design as the STARSCOURGE Greatsword, and it's just worse than the STARSCOURGE Greatsword because that weapon just gets a better skill and more damage. Number 14, the Troll's Golden Sword. Now, this is one of the many infusible Colossal Swords in this game, and Colossal Swords that can be infused are just always going to be good, because there's so many amazing weapon skill pairings that can make every single one of these things just really good. Just slap on things like Lion's Claw or Giant Hunt, and every single enemy is just going to be destroyed. Now, the thing is, the Troll's Golden Sword I consider to be the worst amongst them, because there's basically no reason to use it. It doesn't get as much damage as the WATCHDOG'S Greatsword or the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, but the benefit that it does have is that it is a little bit lighter, but it's not that much lighter to warrant me wanting to use it over the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword. And if you did want a lighter option, you can just go with the ZWEIHANDER, which is going to get less damage, but it does get a poking heavy attack, which just makes it a lot better in my opinion. Number 13, the WATCHDOG'S Greatsword. Now, the main reason you would want to use a weapon like this is because you're different and you're just not like the other girls that use the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword. You're just like so much better than them. But no, in all seriousness, there is like no reason to use this thing over the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, because for a very similar weight and requirements, you just get much more range and much more damage in every single infusion, except for the magic infusion for some reason. At like really high levels, the WATCHDOG'S does actually outdamage the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, but you have to be like at 80 intelligence and 40 strength to really benefit. But even then, it's not that much higher to where I'd want to use it over the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, because that just gets more range. Unless you don't like the unique heavy attack that the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword gets with that horizontal swipe, and you'd much rather have the downward slam that the WATCHDOG'S Greatsword has, which I do prefer the downward slam a little bit more, but Colossal Sword heavy attacks are not that good, and if I did have an opening long enough, I'd rather just use a weapon skill instead. But outside of those two specific reasons, just use the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword. Number 12, the MOONRITHYLL'S Knight Sword, which, as I mentioned with the Troll's Knight Sword, this is basically what that one should have been. This skill should have just been put onto that weapon, and it would have been the exact same thing, because Tremendous Phalanx is the skill that the Troll's Knight Sword should have had to begin with, because both of these weapons have the exact same model, same range, same moveset, weight, scalings, damage, all of it is the exact same. But the MOONRITHYLL'S Knight Sword actually has a unique skill. And as for its unique skill, it's actually pretty decent. I think the existence of it is the main reason why Glint's Blade Phalanx got nerfed, because that skill used to do 40 stance damage, but now it just does like a lot less, around about 20. And this skill actually does 27 stance damage, which is pretty nice. It obviously does get that follow-up poking attack, which also just hits very hard, because you are going to be using a Colossal Sword. But there's just a few downsides of this weapon that just make me not want to use it still. And that's one, its skill scales of intelligence, and it gets a D scaling in intelligence. Don't know why this thing couldn't have been a really cool strength and intelligence-based weapon, with like a B scaling in both. That would have been nice. And also, I would have preferred it if it is like lunged a bit further. Something like the Glintstone Chris weapon skill has like a very similar effect with like a magic projectile and a follow-up lunge. And the lunge of that skill just goes a lot further than the lunge of this skill. So it is a still decent skill overall because it is a nice tracking projectile. Against the more smaller or mobile types of enemies, it might just end up missing. But it still is very easy to use and it can still output some nice damage and some nice stance damage. But it could just be a lot better still. Number 11, the Grafted Blade Greatsword, which is actually one of the harder hitting Colossal swords in this game. It actually can outdamage the GODSLAYE'S Greatsword with these strength types of builds, but it won't be by much, and the GODSLAYE'S Greatsword can be buffed, and just slapping a buff onto it is just going to make it do more damage. It also does get more range, and it can be infused with some very broken damaging types of skills. Whereas for the Grafted Blade Greatsword, it does not get a damaging skill, which in a game like this, damaging skills can cheese the entire game from start to finish. But that is not to say that the skill of this weapon is bad at all. Oath of Vengeance is a very solid buff. For 20 FP, it does do two separate things. One, it does give you a bunch more poise and damage negation. It's basically the exact same effect as Endure, just lasts a little bit longer. And it does give you +5 to every single stat for 60 seconds, which this effect is identical to the Godric's Great Rune, but it's just on a timer instead. Now, having the Endure part of the skill is pretty handy for some types of situations, specifically if you are using like spells or skills that don't necessarily get hyper armor. But with this weapon, it actually already gets hyper armor, so you don't really need that extra bit of poise. But the damage negation can be nice. But I think the main purpose of this weapon is just to use its buff and then switch back to your main damaging option. Because after you use the skill and then switch to your main weapon, you can still retain a few seconds of poise, and you will just have a whole minute of just a bit more health, damage, FP, and stamina. Now, it does involve you having to hard swap, which can be a bit tedious, and the weapon does have a bit higher of a strength requirement. You need at least 27 strength just to be able to wield it, so you can't really use this type of buff with all different types of builds. So yeah, as a primary option, I'm not going to value it at all, but its buff can be nice if you wanted to use it with strength types of builds. Number 10, the Royal Greatsword, which is one of the lone strength and intelligence based weapons in the game. Most weapons that do get scalings in both of these stats tend to just get a lot more in one than the other, but the Royal Greatsword does get pretty split even scalings in both, and going into these higher levels can just result in very high damage. This thing can get higher AR than a lot of the other Colossal swords in the game, and its skill, Wolf's Assault, is pretty cheap for how much damage that it does do. Now, there are going to be a few downsides with this skill. I think my biggest gripe is that the damage is split up into two parts. One is the slam, and the other one is the AoE, and this initial slam attack has a very small hitbox that has a very good chance of missing, so every single time that you just miss with this initial slamming attack, you just miss out on half the damage. And upon landing on the ground, there is a little bit of a delay until the explosion does come out, and in that little part, you can get staggered out of it, because unlike the first part of the animation, you don't get infinite hyper armor. But if you land the entire combo, this thing can hit really hard and also do a bit of frost buildup as well, which is kind of like another unfortunate thing about it. It doesn't proc frost that quickly, especially because the weapon doesn't actually get passive frost. You only get frost on that skill. So if the weapon did have some passive frost and a bit more hyper armor, I'd probably put it a bit higher on the list. Number 9, the Greatsword of RADAHN Lord. Now, as much as I hate the Greatsword of RADAHN, this one is actually not too bad. As for the weapon itself, it is just a power stance or paired Colossal sword. It does just get the regular basic moveset, which I think the major benefit of this is that you only need to upgrade one weapon and actually have the weight of one weapon, but be able to power stance as well. Like, this thing only weighs 19 units and you get 2 weapons. Now, the major downside is that the STARSCOURGE Greatsword basically does the exact same thing, but it just gets way more damage. Like, the scalings of this thing just suck. But in terms of its skill, it actually is very solid, and you could just use this skill to just replace the light attack combos completely. Now, if you only have like a really small opening, then that's probably not going to be the case because the starting animation can be a little bit long, but the damage output is definitely there. It can lunge in very far, it can stun lock smaller enemies, and those little Holy Pillar after shockwave effects can actually output some nice damage, especially if you do go high into that intelligence stat. Now, unfortunately, only gets a descaling in intelligence, so you're kind of speccing into either this weapon damage or the holy damage, which can be kind of annoying. But if you do manage to get the entire combo off, which does consume about 40 FP, which might seem a bit expensive, but the damage is definitely worth it in my opinion. But as I mentioned with the light version of the Greatsword of RADAHN, these weapons could have just been so much better. Definitely starting off with their scalings. Like, this thing should definitely have a much better scaling. This thing should definitely be getting more damage than the STARSCOURGE Greatsword. And just let it have a cool blood flaming attack. Like, give it some blood flame heavy attack, please. Number 8, the MALIKETH'S Blackblade, which is a very solid strength and faith-based Colossal sword. Actually does get some of the highest AR out of all the Colossal swords. Now, it is going to be doing split holy damage, so having the highest amount of AR isn't really going to mean much when most of the enemies in the base game are just going to be resist to this damage type. But it is going to perform very nicely in the DLC at least, and also perform very well in New Game Plus because its skill, Destined Death, is a very hard-hitting attack that obviously does do a Destined Death damage over time effect, and this is percentage damage, so against enemies with really large amounts of HP, this is just going to melt them like butter. Like it quite literally can be one of the hardest hitting attacks in the entire game. Now there are going to be some downsides. One, it consumes 40 FP, which is definitely a lot. And the skill is a long animation that does have lots of hype armor in the recovery animations, which is kind of annoying. Like I don't want to get hype armor and be able to tank attacks in the recovery frames, because at that point I've already used my attack. Just like stagger me and just let me roll away. But you're going to be tanking a lot of damage every single time that you use the skill. But in most cases, you probably end up winning the trade. Number 7, the STARSCOURGE Greatsword. Now, I think this weapon has an S tier skill, but as for the weapon itself, I cannot really say the same thing. Now, much like the Greatsword of RADAHN, it actually does get the power stancing Colossal Sword moveset when two-handed. And as I mentioned with the Greatswords of RADAHN's, this one actually does just get more damage. And just being able to upgrade one weapon and also not have to spec into much endurance because these things are pretty light, it actually is very nice. Now, unfortunately, there are just a few downsides. One, it is the shortest Colossal Sword in the game. And two, I just don't really care much to have power stance Colossal Swords. I just much rather two-hand them because they're going to be faster, going to get a better moveset because they involve getting more horizontal swipes. They also do get the better rolling attack because it actually is a nice poke, whereas with this weapon, it's like a shitty ass downward slam. And the most annoying things about them is that they get terrible stance damage. For some reason, the STARSCOURGE Greatsword paired combos just get worse stance damage than just regular power stance Colossal Swords. Like this thing only gets 11 stance damage, which to prove how stupid this thing is, if you were to just one-hand this weapon, one light attack is going to do 15 stance damage. Like it just gets more stance damage one-handed compared to just two-handed. But as for this skill though, Starcaller Cry, I think this thing is just incredible. For 20 FP, it does this big AoE sucking attack that covers so much distance, and all smaller enemies around you are just going to get sucked in, and you can do your massive follow-up attack that gets amazing hyper armor and just outputs stupid amounts of damage. Like this thing, this hits so hard and does it in a very nice AoE as well. Like any single time you're in a room surrounded by enemies, this thing can just destroy them. Like it might be one of the better crowd control weapons in the entire game. Like I think it's literally an S tier option at doing that. And even against regular single target enemies, it actually can perform pretty nicely too, because it does get some very good hyper armor. Now there are going to be a couple of downsides. One is that the entire combo consumes 40 FP. I don't know why like the initial raw attack consumes 20 and then the follow-up consumes an additional 20. I think the first part should have only consumed 10 FP. But the most annoying thing is that this skill also does pretty bad stance damage too. That follow-up slamming attack that you see on screen, like it's such an insane looking slamming attack, and it only does 10 stance damage. Like the initial raw attack that you see that sucks the enemies in, that does 15 stance damage, but the slam does only 10. Why? It's such a big hard-hitting type weapon that does amazing damage, but trying to stance break with this thing between both the skill and the light attack combos, it's just kind of shit. If it has had better stance damage in those areas, I'd gladly put it into the S tier, but unfortunately there's just a few too many downsides. Number 6, the Ruin's Greatsword, which is a very good strength-based weapon in this game. It does get a little bit of an intelligence scaling, but it basically is non-existent. Like you just go all into strength to benefit off using it, as it does get an S scaling in that stat. Now this weapon actually is tied for the heaviest Colossal Sword in the game, and actually has some of the worst range as well. But the total overall damage can be very good. At these higher amounts of strength levels, it can get just as much damage, if not more damage than the GODS'S Greatsword. Now if you actually did put like a weapon buff on the GODS'S Greatsword, it can just get more damage than the Ruin's Greatsword. But thankfully the Ruin's Greatsword does have a few things going for it. One, it actually is very good at blocking. So if you actually wanted to pair it alongside a deflecting build, it can make for a nice pairing. It's not going to do anywhere near as well as colossal weapons in terms of these guard countering builds, but it does just add another element to the weapon. Also does get a unique charged heavy attack that actually does leave a little bit of a gravity AoE. Now this actually does make it better and worse in some cases, because the most annoying thing about this heavy is that this gravity shockwave attack is kind of balanced with the heavy attack itself. It's not really just like a free attack on top, because the main weapon actually just gets lower motion values in both damage and stance damage. Like all other colossal weapons can just hit harder with its heavy attack and do more stance damage, but it's only when you actually hit with the gravity shockwave that it ends up being the hardest hitting one and the one that has the highest stance damage. But there are plenty of cases where you just end up missing with the gravity attack, and then in that instance you have the worst heavy attack. But the best part about the weapon is going to be its skill Wave of Destruction, which for 25 FP does shoot out this insane projectile attack that is very reminiscent of the Blasphemous Blade in Taker's Flame. Now Taker's Flame is just going to be better, but since the Blasphemous Blade nerf, this thing actually does now have its uses, because before the nerf, the Blasphemous Blade just did more damage, did more stance damage, knocked enemies backwards, and just gave you health regen. But now the Blasphemous Blade did get a hit in terms of its stance damage and no longer sends enemies flying, but the Ruined Greatsword didn't get changed at all. It actually still knocks enemies backwards, and it can stun lock a lot of these smaller types of targets. And now the Ruined Greatsword does get more stance damage with the projectile, but it still only does 17 stance damage, and when hitting with this thing at point blank range, it does 23 stance damage, damage, which is actually less than the Blasphemous Blade. The Blasphemous Blade at close range does 24 stance damage. I don't know why this big massive gravity weapon does less stance damage than the Blasphemous Blade with its skill. That's kind of annoying, but it still is going to serve for one of the best physical types of projectiles in the game. Number 5, the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, which seems to be like a very good dexterity and faith-based weapon, but this thing just has a very terrible faith scaling. I don't know why they gave it a C scaling in faith, because it doesn't scale well off that stat at all. In fact, this thing actually scales better with strength than it does in faith. So if you actually wanted to optimize the damage of this thing, you just go all into dexterity and just put some excess points into strength, maybe have a bit more faith just to use Golden Vow. But yeah, this thing is definitely not a dex faith weapon. But thankfully the skill does scale off AR, so just going all into strength is just going to benefit you anyway. And the weapon itself is still going to be amazing because it does get a very nice light attack combo. It does get those diagonal swipes, which are just faster to have than like the regular Colossal Sword movesets. Now, since the DLC, it's no longer a unique combo because the Fire Knight's Greatsword also does the same thing, and that one can just get more damage, can be infused, which makes it more versatile, and this gets the better heavy attack too. So kind of just inherently made this one a little bit worse, but since the DLC releasing, it finally got fixed to where the skill now gets hyper armor, and it can trade out, which the skill itself is just an absolute monster. Like, this thing can just destroy every single enemy in the entire game. It just outputs stupid amounts of damage and actually adds a black flame damage over time effect on top of that. So against enemies with really large amounts of HP, it's just going to shred them. And I think the most underrated part about it is that it does actually extend the weapon's range as well. So you're going to hit at these further distances, do amazing damage, and only really consume 30 FP for the entire combo. The speed of the first part of the skill is probably going to make it a little bit situational, because against enemies that give you really small openings, it might not be the most useful thing. But in that instance, you can just use the light attack combos, and they will just be better. Number 4, the Fire Knight's Greatsword, which has the best moveset out of all the Colossal Swords in the entire game. Gets the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword light attack combo and the ZWEIHANDER heavy attack, which is basically everything that you really need. You get faster light attacks, they get better hit detection, and then you get a faster heavy attack that does piercing damage. Now, if you did want to go into a charged heavy attack build, you're probably going to get a bit more out of the ZWEIHANDER anyway, because that weapon doesn't actually get any split scalings, so that one might serve as the better option. But if you want us to go into a faith build, then the Fire Knight's Greatsword is for you, because it actually does come passive with a faith scaling and some split fire damage, but can be infused. So going into a faith type of infusion with preferably a flame art build is just going to make it do really high amounts of damage. Now, unfortunately, it does make it a little bit limited, because if you were to actually go into different types of infusions like a sacred infusion, you're not going to really benefit as much. But the fact that you can infuse it does make it versatile. So if you did want to go into different types of builds outside of faith, I'd recommend just going with some of the other options. But with a faith build with particular faith types of skills, the Fire Knight's Greatsword is your best option, and it just gets the best moveset too. So that alone is just enough reason to put it into the S tier. Now, the only reason I'm not going to put it at number 1 is because with Colossal Swords, the best pairings are going to be things like Giant Hunt and Lion's Claw, and those are going to be better with other weapons. And if you want to go with a charged heavy attack build, you're probably still better off with the ZWEIHANDER. Which leads me into number 3, the ZWEIHANDER itself, which is the lightest Colossal Sword in the entire game. Does actually get the lowest amount of requirements. You get it right at the beginning of the game, which means that you don't really need to invest in many stats just to benefit of Colossal Sword damage. Now, it's later levels, you might think that you're just better off going with another different type of weapon, because the base damage is not going to be as high. But this thing does get a poking heavy attack, which not only are poking attacks just typically faster, but they're going to be doing piercing damage. And as I always mention, piercing damage is the best damage type, as a lot of enemies are weaker to it, and counter-attack damage exists. So when enemies are in the middle of an attack combo, they're just going to take bonus damage, and the ZWEIHANDER might just be the hardest hitting weapon at doing that. So going with a charged heavy attack build, the ZWEIHANDER can just destroy a lot of enemies faster than almost everything else. Now, if you didn't really care to go with a charged heavy attack build and you wanted to use like another different damaging type of skill, you could still do that too, because this thing can be infused, and you're just going to benefit by having the lightest Colossal Sword with the lowest requirements. Number 2, the Ancient Meteoric or Greatsword, which actually is the longest Colossal Sword in the game. Does scale pretty well off both strength and arcane. It does get a little bit of split magic damage, and does get to these ZWEIHANDER poking heavy attack, which I just glazed as being an amazing attack to have. But even then, the best thing about the weapon is going to be its skill White Light Charge, which for 10 FP has you lunge into an enemy basically instantly and closes in the gap. Now, this poking attack isn't going to do the most amazing damage, but the whole purpose of it is just to take you from A to B as quick as possible. So if you do see that you have an opening at a distance, using this skill can essentially just like teleport you right there, and then give you the option of a high damaging follow-up attack for 25 FP that just shoots out this massive AoE explosion that does actually scale off AR, so you don't have to go into arcane just to benefits. And this explosion does amazing damage, good stance damage, sends smaller enemies flying, and does it in an AoE. It's such a great, easy to use and versatile skill that's honestly amazing in almost every single situation in the game. Against enemies that don't really give you much of an opening, that are really aggressive, it might not be the most amazing thing, but in that instance, you could just use the heavy attacks, because the heavy attacks are just really good too. Or you could pair it alongside a deflecting build, because this thing actually does have some very decent blocking. It's just right behind the Ruin's Greatsword in terms of its blocking capabilities. So there are many different ways that you can build around the Ancient Meteoric or Greatsword, and every single one is just really good. And at number 1, the Greatsword, or the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, however you want to refer to it. This is just the best Colossal sword in the game in my opinion. Out of all the ones that can be infused, it gets the most range, and it gets the most damage. And with Colossal swords, you can pair them with certain types of skills like Lion's Claw or Giant Hunt, potentially even things like Vacuum Slice, and you have yourself a just a complete busted and broken build. And the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword is just going to be the best pairing for those skills. All you gotta do is equip it, put the skill on, just spam L2, and then you just win. Like, there is just nothing else that you need to do. It makes for one of the most easiest and brain-dead playstyles in the entire game, and you can pick up most of the things for this build right at the beginning of the game, and it can carry you from start to finish with great ease. Anyway, that is the video now done. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. Now, as for the next video, I'm probably just going to cover the thrusting swords. Just let me know if you think I should combine the two or just separate them. But either way, those are going to be next. And also do follow me on Twitch, because I actually am live every single day doing a bunch of different challenge runs. And yeah, catch you guys around. Bye.